Silence,
Hey guys,
foul creature.
tonight we begin
your
with a medieval
oinks cannot
bureaucrat,
hide your
the
guilt.
most dangerous
The
creature
court
in
finds
history.
you guilty as
The
charged.
Middle Ages were full of bizarre laws, but what most people don't know is that many of them existed because of one incredibly stupid, chaotic, or downright unbelievable
Did you
event.
see the eyes on that
So before you
beast?
get comfortable,
unnatural, I tell
take a
you.
moment to
The
like the
curse is
video
real.
and subscribe,
We must warn the
but
others
only if
before
you
it strikes
genuinely
again.
enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. It's hard to imagine, but in medieval France, a pig once stood trial for murder and lost. The year was 1386, and somewhere in the French town of Falaise, a pig made history by becoming the first defendant with hooves. One morning, this ordinary sow, nameless, guiltless, and very possibly just hungry, wandered into the street and attacked a child. Tragic? Absolutely. But this was the Middle Ages, where logic took centuries-long naps. So instead of eating the pig or shrugging it off as farm life, the townsfolk decided to put it on trial for murder. Yes, a full trial, with robes, judges, witnesses, and an attorney for the pig. The creature was chained, formally charged, and brought before a courtroom packed with serious-looking men pretending this wasn't insane. It was accused of acting with malice aforethought, which, if true, makes it one of the most intelligent pigs in recorded history. A defense lawyer was assigned. Probably the most awkward gig in legal history. Imagine standing in front of a medieval jury saying, "My client oinks in protest." The judge listened, nodded gravely, and then declared the sow guilty. Because, of course, pigs are notorious repeat offenders. The punishment? Death by hanging. The same method used for humans, because consistency matters in jurisprudence. The town gathered to watch as the pig was dressed in human clothes, shirt, breeches and all, led to the gallows and executed in front of an enthusiastic crowd. Nothing says civilization like a public execution of farm animals. The trial caused such a stir that the Bishop of Falaise had to intervene. Apparently, people had started executing livestock without church approval, which was a big no-no. So a new law was passed. No animal could be tried or executed without ecclesiastical authorization. In other words, even pigs now needed permission from God's middle management. The precedent stuck. Soon Europe was full of criminal animals. Roosters tried for witchcraft, goats accused of immorality, and cows fined for trespassing. Humanity had officially reached peak accountability. Everything had rights, except humans. It's easy to laugh now, but in medieval logic, everything, even a pig, existed in God's moral ecosystem. And if that ecosystem went rogue, someone had to hang for it. Unfortunately, that someone was usually bacon. If there's one thing the medieval era excelled at, besides dying young and inventing unnecessary laws, it was taking jokes too far. Sometime in the 14th century, in Bohemia, a bored nobleman decided that tournaments were getting repetitive. Same horses, same lances, same concussions. So, he showed up to a joust with something no one expected. A goose. Not a roasted goose. Not a pet goose. A fully armoured one. According to local chronicles, the knight had commissioned a tiny set of plate armour for the bird, complete with a miniature helmet. He proudly declared it his squire, paraded it around the tilt yard, and even gave it a name, Sir Hiss of the Pond. Because why not give your poultry a title? It was supposed to be funny, until it wasn't. During the event, the goose apparently escaped, flapping across the field in a blur of feathers and polished metal. One squire tried to grab it. The goose bit him on the hand, then promptly rammed into a horse's legs. The horse panicked, threw its rider, and chaos erupted. By the time the dust settled, 3 knights were injured, a goose was dead, and everyone had learned that birds make terrible armour-bearers. Naturally, instead of laughing it off, the authorities reacted the medieval way, by legislating it. A decree was issued banning the dressing, arming, or mounting of animals in imitation of noble combatants. The ruling also extended to beasts of burden, fowl, and pets of domestic origin, which is legal Latin for "don't give your chicken a sword." The story spread across Central Europe, becoming a running joke among knights who secretly envied the goose's courage. Some even claimed it was cursed, that the spirit of Sir Hiss haunted jousts forever, flapping invisibly over tilting fields, whispering, "You'll never be as brave as me." Still, the law remained on the books for decades. Future generations read it, utterly confused, and wondered what catastrophe could have inspired it. The answer, of course, was one very determined goose and one knight with too much free time. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, stupidity had wings. If you ever think your job is stressful, remember that in medieval Germany, people's hobbies involved riding 600-kilogram horses at full speed while holding a spear, and drinking heavily before doing it. In 1364, a nobleman named Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg showed up to a jousting tournament absolutely plastered. This wasn't unusual. Knights were expected to drink, partly because medieval water could kill you faster than the tournament itself. But Heinrich took it further. He insisted he fought better while spiritually fortified. He was, technically, right. He just forgot that the spirit part wasn't supposed to be literal. Accounts say he entered the arena swaying in the saddle, dropped his lance 3 times, and still shouted, "Let the glory of St. Michael guide my aim." Seconds later, he missed his opponent entirely and impaled a nearby monk who had been praying for everyone's safety, which is, you have to admit, darkly poetic. The scandal was immediate. The church was horrified, the crowd was entertained, and the monk, miraculously, survived, though he reportedly spent the rest of his life avoiding outdoor events. The local duke, realizing this could turn into another pig trial situation, called an emergency council. The result? A brand new law. No knight shall compete in tournament or trial of arms while under the influence of drink or fermented brew. It was Europe's first recorded anti-drunk driving regulation, except the vehicles were horses and the airbags were monks. Naturally, knights protested. They claimed alcohol calmed the nerves and steadied the hand, which might have been true if the hand wasn't holding a 14-foot spear. The church backed the ban, arguing that a sober knight honours God. The knights replied, "A sober knight loses sponsors." Thus began the great medieval debate between piety and party culture. Despite the law, enforcement was tricky. Jousting officials weren't exactly breathalyzers. The best they could do was sniff helmets. Still, the drunken joust decree became official law throughout the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't stop knights from drinking. It just made them more creative about when. And that's how one inebriated noble turned medieval chivalry into a cautionary tale. Proof that even in armour, stupidity finds a way. In medieval England, bread wasn't just food. It was politics you could eat. Every loaf, crust and crumb was regulated by law. Bakers had to follow the assize of bread and ale, which dictated size, weight and price down to the ounce. But nowhere did it mention shape, until one ambitious baker ruined everything. Sometime in the 14th century, a baker in London decided to show off. Maybe he was bored, maybe he wanted attention, or maybe he just didn't understand the word humble. He baked a beautiful, round loaf, embossed with a decorative ring around the top. Unfortunately, that ring looked exactly like the king's crown. Within days, the loaf was a hit at the market. People called it the royal bread. One customer even joked it looked fit for His Majesty's table. In a society where sarcasm was a capital offence, that comment was enough to start an inquest. Word reached a royal official, who took one look at the bread and decided treason had entered the bakery. The baker was dragged before a magistrate, accused of mocking the image and authority of the crown through insolent baking, which, if nothing else, proves medieval lawyers had incredible imaginations. He was fined heavily and forced to stand in the stocks with his bread around his neck, the first known case of public carb shaming. To prevent any future bread-based blasphemy, Parliament issued a new regulation. No loaf was to bear royal or sacred resemblance in shape or design. In short, bake all you want, but don't get artistic. Creativity was now a crime. It's ridiculous, but this wasn't an isolated case. Medieval rulers feared symbolic rebellion. People couldn't criticize the crown, but they could mock it, even in pastry form. And nothing scared kings quite like the idea that commoners might find humour in their divine authority. So yes, one overly decorative loaf of bread gave birth to the first anti-satire law in English culinary history. The moral? In medieval Europe, never let your food look smarter than your king. Because in a world where you could be executed for puns, baking fancy bread was practically revolution. Monks were supposed to be the picture of discipline. Silent, devoted, and definitely not remixing hymns into love songs. Unfortunately, not everyone in the monastery agreed. The story begins in the 14th century Italy, where a group of Benedictine monks decided to add a little passion to their chanting. Gregorian hymns were repetitive, slow, and depressingly holy. So one night, a particularly creative monk, historians suspect wine was involved, slipped in a few verses borrowed from a popular tavern tune about a maiden fair and faithless. The rhythm caught on. Soon half the abbey was humming it between prayers. At first the abbot ignored it. Then one morning, he caught two monks rehearsing harmonies in the cloister. Worse, they were calling it the Song of St. Cecilia's Eyes. You can imagine the confusion when pilgrims started requesting the track. It escalated from there. Vespers became a nightly concert. The brothers began sneaking instruments into the chapel, a lute here, a small drum there, until one night a monk brought in a tambourine, and that was it. The abbot snapped. He summoned the entire choir, gave a fiery sermon about temptation, and announced a new rule that would go down in monastic history. No singing or musical performance shall occur after the hour of sunset. In other words, the world's first medieval noise complaint. Naturally, the monks were furious. They argued music brought them closer to God. The abbot replied that God probably preferred silence. The next evening, the monastery fell quiet, until someone started whistling the forbidden tune from behind the wine cellar. The punishment was fasting, which, in monastic terms, is the equivalent of being grounded indefinitely. Within months, neighbouring abbeys copied the regulation, citing disruptive nocturnal chanting. Word spread to Rome, where one cardinal reportedly commented, "If monks must sing, let it be soberly, not seductively." The ban survived for centuries, long after the abbey burned down. The irony: those same monks accidentally invented early polyphony, the musical foundation of European choral art. So, the next time you hear a church choir, thank a few rebellious monks who got tired of monotony, added a beat, and got legally silenced for it. Because even holiness, apparently, had a bedtime. Few things capture medieval thinking better than this. A nobleman once accused peasants of getting his fish drunk. The story takes place in the 15th century England, where Lord Humphrey of Catterick owned a grand estate, several horses, and a disturbingly personal relationship with his carp pond. These weren't just any fish. He named them, fed them, and according to one account, spoke to them as one might counsel loyal servants. So when his prized carp began swimming erratically after a village festival, he assumed the worst. The villagers had, he claimed, poured ale into the pond. And not just any ale, his ale. He demanded an inquiry. The local reeve arrived, poked at the fish with a stick, and reported that they did in fact appear uncommonly jolly. That was enough. Lord Humphrey declared it an act of sabotage and summoned the village elders for questioning. Their defence was simple. We were drunk, not the fish. Naturally, that didn't fly. The nobleman ordered a court proceeding, which, as expected, found the peasants guilty of the willful inebriation of aquatic life. The punishment? A fine, the draining of the pond, and, because medieval justice loved paperwork, the creation of a new ordinance. Let no man or woman pour ale, wine, or spirituous drink into waters wherein swim the creatures of the Lord, and thus was born the law of drunken fish. It sounds like a joke, but the regulation actually spread. Neighbouring estates adopted similar rules, mostly because they didn't want their lords bothering Parliament with carp-related emergencies. It eventually became shorthand for "don't waste alcohol on animals," which, to be fair, is probably good advice. The best part? A later chronicler noted that the fish were perfectly fine. They'd simply been sluggish from heat, meaning an entire law was based on misinterpreting fish behaviour. In the end, the villagers paid their fine, the pond was refilled, and Lord Humphrey continued to refer to his carp as noble creatures of refined taste. And that's how one hot summer day gave medieval England its first recorded animal sobriety law. Because even fish, apparently, had to know their limits. In the medieval world, church bells were sacred. They marked births, deaths, storms, and occasionally when a blacksmith sneezed too loud. But in one unlucky French town, a bell's greatest sin wasn't ringing too often. It was trying to escape. The year was 1324, and the town of Autumn had just commissioned a massive bronze bell for its new church tower. It was beautiful, heavy, and absurdly over-decorated. The kind of bell that screamed, "Our parish has money." On the day of its grand unveiling, the townsfolk gathered as priests blessed it. Nobles nodded approvingly, and children stared in awe. Then came the test ring. A few minutes later, disaster struck. A storm rolled in from nowhere, thunder roared, and lightning hit the tower directly. The bell broke loose from its beam, crashed through the floor, and rolled down the church steps like a divine bowling ball. Witnesses swore it moved with purpose, crushing barrels, chickens, and at least one unlucky bench before finally lodging itself in a fruit cart. When the dust settled, the mayor declared, quite seriously, that the bell had fled from its sacred duty, which of course meant one thing in medieval France: a law had to be made. The council issued a decree. All church bells shall henceforth be bound with chains or cords to prevent ungodly flight. And thus was born the law of runaway bells. Local blacksmiths got to work bolting every bell in town. Priests held special blessings to ensure no more bell rebellion. Meanwhile, townspeople whispered that the rogue bell had been possessed, a divine sign of displeasure with the mayor's taxes. Ironically, this new bell restraint trend spread across France. By the late 14th century, some cathedrals even chained their bells so tightly they could barely ring, leading to complaints that God might not be hearing them properly. Decades later, travellers still told the tale of the autumn bell that tried to escape judgment. It became a kind of cautionary legend, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even inanimate objects could be blamed for misbehaviour. And somewhere in a dusty archive, that law remains recorded, proof that once upon a time France legally outlawed runaway church bells, because in medieval logic, even metal needed supervision. You'd think medieval priests would have been too busy saving souls to swing swords. You'd be wrong. Sometime in the late 12th century, in the Kingdom of Castile, a priest named Father Rodrigo de Navarre got into a heated theological debate with a knight. The topic? Whether St. Michael could defeat a mortal warrior in single combat. It started as harmless pub theology, the kind you'd expect after 5 pints of monastery ale. But pride was the currency of the Middle Ages, and neither man could back down. The knight called Rodrigo a coward in cloth. Rodrigo replied, "May God strike you down, or failing that, I shall." The next morning, both men showed up in a field outside town, one with armour and a lance, the other in robes, clutching a sword that still had candle wax on it. Witnesses claim Rodrigo actually opened the duel by blessing himself, which might be history's most confident flex. Against all odds, he managed to disarm the knight with a lucky swing. The crowd erupted. The church did not. When word reached the bishop, he nearly had a stroke. A priest defeating a knight in trial by combat was unthinkable, not because it was sinful, but because it was embarrassing. The bishop feared it would set a precedent. Clergy settling arguments through the sword rather than the spirit. Within a week, a council convened in Toledo, and the ruling was clear. No servant of God shall henceforth bear arms, nor engage in duel, tourney, or violent sport. And thus, the clergy combat ban was born, the medieval church's version of HR saying, "Please stop fighting your co-workers." Of course, enforcement was spotty. Some warrior monks ignored it entirely. The Templars probably laughed while polishing their swords. But ordinary priests got the message. The next time someone called them cowards, they simply muttered, "I'd smite you, but canon law forbids it." Still, the story of Father Rodrigo spread far and wide, part cautionary tale, part legend. Some say his sword was confiscated and reforged into a crucifix. Others claim he was quietly promoted for unorthodox defence of the faith. Either way, one drunken duel forever separated the clergy from the chivalry, proving that sometimes holiness and hand-to-hand combat just don't mix. Of all the strange laws the Middle Ages produced, few are as gloriously petty as the one that banned whistling. It happened in the 13th century Germany, in a quiet little town along the Rhine, where the biggest excitement most days was watching grain dry. Then came Hans the shepherd, a man with lungs like bagpipes and a whistle that could summon demons, or at least annoy everyone within a mile. Hans was famous for it. He could whistle entire hymns, bird songs, or what he proudly called the tune of the wind. The problem was that his talent didn't stop at daylight. He whistled in the morning, at dinner, during Mass, and worst of all, at night. One evening, as the legend goes, his whistling startled a noblewoman's horses just as her carriage crossed the town bridge. The panicked animals bolted, sending her straight into the river. She survived, drenched, furious, and swearing vengeance. Within days, a town council convened to discuss the disturbance of the peace by oral means. The verdict was swift and very German. No man, woman, or child shall whistle in public after the toll of the evening bell. And so began the law of forbidden whistles. Hans was devastated. He tried to argue that his music soothed the sheep and pleased the Lord, but nobody cared. The noblewoman still smelled of swamp water, and the mayor's patience was gone. When Hans was caught whistling again a week later, he was fined 3 loaves of bread and a flagon of ale, the medieval equivalent of a parking ticket. Ironically, this law spread faster than the tune that caused it. Other towns adopted it, citing noise pollution and moral disturbance. Some claimed that night whistling attracted witches, or worse, tax collectors. By the 15th century, entire German provinces had outlawed nighttime whistling altogether. The funniest part? Historians found a later note in one town ledger stating, "The silence is unbearable. The sheep now cry at night, so they repealed it." Partially. In short, one man's melodic obsession turned into 2 centuries of legally enforced quiet hours. Because in medieval Europe, even joy required a curfew. There are many reasons laws exist: to preserve order, prevent chaos, or, in this case, to stop one man from sanding wood in the nude. The story comes from the 15th century Prague, a city famous for its cathedrals, scholars, and apparently very confident carpenters. During a particularly hot summer, one craftsman named Marek the Builder was repairing a section of the city wall. The sun was brutal, the air thick, and Marek, deciding that modesty was optional, stripped off everything but his work boots and continued hammering away like Adam with a hammer. By mid-morning, the spectacle had drawn quite an audience. Unfortunately, that audience included a royal procession passing through the city gate. Among the onlookers was Queen Barbara of Scilly, who was reportedly not amused. Accounts differ on what shocked her more: the nudity or the enthusiasm with which Marek waved his mallet in greeting. By evening, word had spread across Prague. A naked man laboured before the Queen. It sounded poetic. It was not. The city council convened immediately. There were discussions about morality, decency, and the dangers of distracting royalty with unsolicited anatomy. The verdict was unanimous. Something had to be done. Thus the council introduced the Naked Carpenter Ordinance, a law declaring that no man or artisan shall ply his trade unclothed within sight of Her Majesty or the public square. Marek was fined, publicly lectured, and reportedly muttered, "Then perhaps the wall shall fall again." To prevent future offences, guildmasters across the city added a clause to their codes requiring appropriate attire during labour. And just like that, one sweaty carpenter gave birth to medieval Europe's first recorded workplace dress code. The story spread faster than Marek's tan lines. Other towns followed suit, enacting their own modesty laws. One chronicler even joked that Prague's men now dress for work as if attending church, thanks to one man's devotion to comfort. Centuries later, the ordinance technically remained on the books, an eternal warning that in medieval bureaucracy, embarrassment was a legislative event. And so, from that day on, every craftsman in Prague worked fully clothed, not because it was practical, but because one man couldn't keep his hammer to himself. Of all the crimes committed in medieval Europe, few were as controversial as the one that landed a chicken in court. The year was 1474, in the Swiss city of Basel, a place where people took law, order and poultry very seriously. One morning, a farmer reported that his rooster had laid an egg. This was not, strictly speaking, possible. But rather than celebrating the miracle, the townsfolk reacted with the same calm restraint as always. They accused the bird of witchcraft. The news spread fast. Crowds gathered outside the church, debating whether the egg was the work of the devil. A few suggested it was just a malformed yolk. Others whispered that demons were breeding poultry now. Eventually, someone decided the only solution was a trial. So the rooster was formally arrested, confined in a small wooden cage, and charged with unnatural production. A public defender was appointed, which in hindsight feels optimistic. The trial drew hundreds. The judge solemnly listened, as witnesses swore that they had seen the egg with their own eyes, and that the bird had appeared deeply unrepentant. The defence argued that the rooster, being an animal, lacked moral agency. The prosecution countered that Satan worked through beasts. The judge nodded, clearly regretting his career choices, and declared the rooster guilty. The sentence: death by fire. On execution day, the people of Basel gathered in the square. A pyre was built, the rooster placed atop it, and the cursed egg burned alongside. Chroniclers note that many cheered, others prayed, and at least one merchant sold roasted nuts nearby, proving that capitalism never misses an opportunity. After the incident, Basel's city council passed a new ordinance. No citizen shall bring forth claims of infernal poultry without clerical witness. In short, you could still accuse your chicken of witchcraft, but only if a priest signed off on it first. Bureaucracy triumphed once again. Historians later discovered that the egg was probably an undeveloped mass of tissue, not witchcraft. But by then, the legend had taken root, and so Basel became the proud home of the world's only known rooster convicted of witchcraft. A reminder that medieval justice always gave everyone their day in court, even breakfast. In a world that feared witches, ghosts, and improperly cooked stew, it was only a matter of time before someone accused footwear of supernatural activity. The story begins in 14th century Florence, a city of art, ambition, and apparently haunted shoes. A local cobbler named Giovanni di Rossi was known for his craftsmanship. His boots were sturdy, his slippers elegant, and his gossip unmatched. One evening, a nobleman stormed into Giovanni's shop claiming that a pair of boots he'd purchased the week before had walked on their own. Naturally, Giovanni laughed, until the nobleman produced witnesses. 3 servants swore they had seen the boots march across the floor unaided in the middle of the night. One even claimed they clicked in rhythm, as though dancing to invisible music. Within days, the entire neighbourhood was convinced the devil had taken up cobbling. People began inspecting their own shoes for signs of possession. Giovanni's business, once booming, collapsed overnight. To prove his innocence, he called for an investigation, because nothing clears your name like a medieval trial about haunted footwear. The city magistrates took the matter seriously. They summoned theologians, blacksmiths, and a tailor, just in case, to testify. After much debate, the council ruled that no proof of demonic activity could be found. But to prevent future supernatural shoemaking, they drafted a new regulation. No craftsman shall enchant, curse, or otherwise imbue apparel with motion unnatural to its purpose. And thus the law of haunted shoes was born. Giovanni was absolved, though not without irony. His name became a joke. Rossi's dancing boots entered Florentine slang as a term for things that caused trouble without reason. Meanwhile, the nobleman's servants later admitted the truth. One had moved the boots as a prank, and the others joined in for fun. By the time they confessed, however, the law was already carved into the city's records. Centuries later, scholars stumbled upon the decree in the archives, sandwiched between prohibitions on noisy fountains and restrictions on overly scented candles. It's a reminder that in medieval Florence, reality was optional, but legislation was eternal. Because when superstition met government, even your shoes could end up on trial. If you've ever wondered how bureaucracy could possibly interfere with divine intervention, allow me to introduce you to the Church of the Middle Ages, where even miracles required paperwork. The story unfolds in 14th century France, in a small village near Limoges. A farmer named Etienne Dubois returned from Mass one morning claiming that his cow, yes, his cow, had begun weeping during a sermon. Real tears. He swore it was a sign from God, a message of compassion and repentance. His neighbours agreed. The local priest, however, did not. Within days, pilgrims flooded the village. Merchants set up stalls. Someone started selling holy milk in clay jars. The priest begged the bishop to intervene before the place turned into a theological farmer's market. The bishop arrived, sceptical but curious. He inspected the cow, prayed, and waited. Nothing. Then, after a few awkward minutes, the cow blinked and let out a single tear. The crowd gasped. The bishop frowned. This, he declared, requires verification, and thus a tribunal was convened, not for a sin, but for a miracle. After 3 days of investigation, which included interviews with the cow's owner, the local cheesemaker, and one deeply confused veterinarian, the church concluded that while the event was impressive, it lacked sufficient spiritual merit to be considered divine. To prevent future bovine blasphemy, the diocese issued an official decree: let no miracle be proclaimed without episcopal examination, lest false wonders lead the faithful astray. And so the law of unapproved miracles was born. Overnight, spontaneous holiness became a regulated industry. Anyone claiming to have witnessed a miracle, be it a bleeding statue, glowing bread, or an unusually polite sheep, now had to file for approval. Unsanctioned wonder-working was punishable by fine, penance, or worst of all, paperwork. Of course, miracles didn't stop. They just got quieter. Peasants whispered about glowing crucifixes in secret and prayed their saints wouldn't do anything too noticeable. As for Etienne's cow, she was declared blessed but not miraculous, and lived out her days in peace, or mild confusion. And that's how medieval France managed to invent religious quality control, making sure that even heaven followed protocol. Because in the Middle Ages, nothing was truly sacred, except procedure. If there's one thing the medieval nobility loved more than war and wine, it was fashion that made absolutely no sense. The trend began in the 15th century France, when nobles started wearing shoes with absurdly long pointed toes, known as poulaines. At first, they were just stylish, long, narrow, and mildly impractical. But like all fashion trends, someone had to take it too far. By the 1460s, the elite were strutting around with shoes so long they had to tie the tips to their knees with ribbons just to walk straight. One chronicler noted that some noblemen's poulaines were as long as their dignity was short. Another claimed you could tell a man's rank by how far his shoes stuck out, which meant social climbing became dangerously literal. Then came the incident. During a grand mass in Paris, a duke, possibly named Jean de Bourbon, though historians disagree, tripped over his own shoes while kneeling. He crashed face first into a candle stand, setting part of his robe on fire and nearly immolating a bishop. The congregation panicked, the choir screamed, and the duke, scrambling to his feet, promptly tripped again. It was a scene straight out of slapstick, except everyone involved had titles and incense. The king, upon hearing the story, was not amused. He summoned his advisers and declared that fashion must never again endanger the church. And so, in an act of pure royal pragmatism, Parliament passed the toe-length law. No man shall wear shoes with points exceeding 2 inches beyond the foot, upon pain of fine or public ridicule. The nobility was outraged. The shoemakers' guild despaired. Peasants, meanwhile, cheered, though mostly because it gave them something to gossip about while ankle-deep in mud. Naturally, some nobles rebelled, cutting their shoes at the allowed limit, but stuffing the toes with wire to extend them secretly. Others held clandestine, long shoe gatherings, flaunting forbidden footwear by candlelight like smug heretics of fashion. But the king's decree held. Within a decade, the ridiculous points vanished from court life. It said that one anonymous poet summed it up perfectly. Once men's toes reached heaven, now their sense does. And thus, one duke's clumsy combustion brought reason, and shorter shoes, back to France. The Middle Ages were a time of faith, invention, and complete disregard for physics. So it was only a matter of time before a monk decided that if angels could fly, he probably could too. The man's name was Aylmer of Malmesbury, a Benedictine monk from the 11th century England. He was known for his intelligence, curiosity, and apparently his very limited sense of self-preservation. Fascinated by birds and scriptures alike, Aylmer became convinced that flight was possible, not metaphorically but literally. According to chroniclers, he studied the wings of eagles, observed the wind, and eventually built his own prototype glider using wood, cloth, and divine optimism. He told his fellow monks he was seeking to understand God's creation. They probably nodded politely, assuming it was a metaphor. It was not. On a bright day around 1010, Aylmer climbed to the top of Malmesbury Abbey, strapped on his handmade wings, and leapt into the air. For a few glorious seconds, it worked. He soared above the courtyard, wind rushing through his habit, the monks below shouting either prayers or expletives. Historians aren't sure which. But then, as with all medieval engineering projects, gravity made its inevitable comeback. Aylmer crashed spectacularly into a dung heap, breaking both legs but somehow surviving. As he was carried off, he reportedly muttered, "I should have made a tail." The church was less amused. They declared his experiment reckless and bordering on hubris. The abbot convened a council and issued a new rule. Let no man of the cloth attempt to fly under threat of penance or expulsion. And thus was born the ban on flying monks. From that day onward, monks were officially grounded, literally and spiritually. Aylmer, undeterred, spent the rest of his life predicting the return of Halley's comet, proving that even after nearly killing himself, he was still centuries ahead of everyone else. Ironically, his banned flight is now considered one of the earliest recorded attempts at human aviation, meaning a medieval monk technically beat Leonardo da Vinci to the skies by 500 years. But the church wasn't impressed. They'd seen enough flying men for 1 millennium, and so ended the age of airborne monks, not with a prayer, but with a very undignified landing. Power in the Middle Ages was a delicate thing, an illusion built on alliances, smiles, and secrets. Kings ruled by the sword, but those who truly survived learned to kill without ever unsheathing it. Poison became the invisible hand that shaped dynasties, the whispered alternative to open rebellion. It was cleaner than bloodshed, quieter than daggers, and infinitely more terrifying. A single drop of toxin could decide the fate of a kingdom before the first blade was ever drawn. At royal banquets, danger was served alongside roasted pheasants and spiced wine. Nobles laughed and toasted, but every sip was taken with quiet hesitation. The most powerful lords employed tasters, men or slaves whose only purpose was to die first if the food was tainted. Some survived for years, others only for a night. In great courts like Paris, Venice, and London, people didn't just fear their enemies. They feared their friends, their cooks, their wives. Poison was considered a refined art, one that belonged to those who understood subtlety. A sword killed the body. Poison destroyed the soul because it replaced trust with paranoia. To the ambitious, it was the perfect weapon. It left no witnesses, only rumours. It killed kings without rebellion, silenced rivals without war, and erased heirs without scandal. Its presence transformed the very etiquette of court life. The most innocent gestures, passing a goblet, kissing a hand, biting into fruit, became rituals of danger. Women wore perfume laced with toxins, noblemen carried rings with hidden needles, and even rosaries were rumoured to conceal deadly dusts. A courteous offer of wine could be a death sentence, a shared meal, an act of mutual suspicion. Yet poison was more than a weapon. It was a language. In an era where words could be fatal, poison spoke in silence. A sudden illness in a duke, a queen's pale complexion, a slow death mistaken for divine punishment. All were coded messages, warnings from those who ruled behind curtains. The Middle Ages were an age of faith and fear, of gold and gall. And behind every jewelled goblet and glittering feast lurked a question that chilled the bravest hearts. Who will drink first? Beneath the grandeur of castles and cathedrals, another world thrived. A world of mortar, pestle, and secrecy. The apothecaries of the Middle Ages were the quiet alchemists of power, their shops heavy with the scent of herbs, oils, and something darker. To the public, they were healers, preparing ointments for burns or tonics for sleepless nobles. But behind locked doors, they mixed death with the same precision as medicine. A few grains too many could silence a bishop. A drop too few could let him live to denounce his murderer. These men and women walked a fine line between science and sorcery. Their shelves were lined with glass jars of nightshade, belladonna, hemlock, and mercury, all perfectly legal in the right hands, utterly damning in the wrong. Many of them were students of old Greek and Arabic texts, blending Hippocrates with whispers from Persia and Egypt. They spoke of philosophical poisons, concoctions that killed slowly, beautifully, and without leaving a trace. Royal courts coveted them, feared them, and punished them in equal measure. A good apothecary could make a prince sleep forever, yet the same man might be burned as a heretic if his concoctions ever turned against the crown. Some found safety by aligning themselves with queens or powerful mistresses, offering them protection in the form of vials hidden in jewellery boxes. Others lived in exile, their knowledge too dangerous to be left alive. Their workrooms were dim and damp, often lit only by candlelight. Pestles ground powders of crushed pearls, snake venom, and arsenic into lethal dusts. They tested their mixtures on rats, dogs, and sometimes prisoners. When the concoctions worked, they gave them elegant names: aquatophana, venenum amoris, or simply the blessed water. In truth, they were curses disguised as cures. And yet, amid the death, there was fascination. Even kings admired their precision. Apothecaries represented the edge of human control over nature, the power to decide who would live and who would die, without lifting a blade. To the devout, it was sin. To the ambitious, it was genius. Every vial held a story, every powder a secret. And when the scent of rosemary and sage drifted through castle corridors, even the most faithful prayed it wasn't hiding something bitter underneath. If poison had a patron saint, it would have been a queen. In a world ruled by men and sharpened steel, royal women discovered that the deadliest power came not from muscle, but from subtlety. Their weapons were not swords or armies. They were goblets, cosmetics, and whispered smiles. When marriage meant alliance and betrayal meant survival, the cup became as dangerous as the crown itself. The great courts of Europe were stages of performance, and queens learned to act beautifully while plotting silently. In England, rumours claimed that Eleanor of Aquitaine's court dined in fear, that rivals grew pale and sick after sharing her table. Whether true or not, the story stuck, because in the Middle Ages, belief was as potent as any venom. Across the Alps, in the glittering courts of Italy, the Borgias perfected the art. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, became legend. Her reputation was so stained by rumour that her name alone came to mean treachery wrapped in silk. It was said that Lucrezia wore a ring with a hidden compartment under a rotating gemstone. A single twist could release a drop of poison into a cup, or onto a fingertip offered in greeting. One sip, one kiss, and a man might begin to cough his last confession. Whether she truly used it or not mattered little. Fear itself was power, and Lucrezia wielded it masterfully. Other women followed her example. Queens in France and Spain learned to command their own apothecaries, demanding mixtures that could soften a husband's temper, or erase him entirely. Lovers, courtiers, even nuns played this silent game, where passion and poison danced together. Love potions were sold by the same merchants who supplied assassins. Many women pretended to seek affection when, in truth, they sought freedom. And yet, for all their cunning, the risk was enormous. If caught, even royal blood could not wash away the stain of murder. A queen might trade her crown for a noose, her beauty for eternal infamy. But in a time when every alliance was fragile, when men held the sword and the throne, these women found their rebellion in secrecy. In the shimmering depths of a jewelled cup, the art of poisoning relied on deception, on taste, texture, and timing. A deadly meal in the Middle Ages did not look suspicious. It looked delicious. Honey-glazed meats, imported wines, and candied fruits from distant lands all provided the perfect camouflage. Poison was tasteless to the careless, but a master assassin could make it part of the flavour. Cinnamon could mask arsenic, wine could hide belladonna, and thick soups could carry death as easily as salt. At royal tables, food became theatre. The kitchen was both a battlefield and a laboratory. Cooks were interrogated before banquets, tasters were summoned like priests, and the first bite of every dish was an act of courage. Some courts even introduced elaborate rituals. The host would eat from every dish first, or servants would perform mock tastings to display loyalty. Still, people died, and when they did, the symptoms, vomiting, seizures, fever, and delirium, were often blamed on divine punishment or bad humours. Few understood the science of poison, even fewer dared to question it. The poisoners, however, understood everything. They knew that timing mattered more than dose. Too fast, and suspicion rose. Too slow, and the target might flee or recover. The ideal poisoner aimed for elegance, death after a day or two, just enough time for rumours to grow and for enemies to make mistakes. Chronic poisons were especially admired. Mercury, antimony, or lead could mimic illness for weeks before killing cleanly. These slow deaths fooled even physicians, who often prescribed more of the very medicine that was killing their patient. One of the most notorious examples was aquatofana, a colourless concoction made of arsenic, lead, and belladonna. It was sold to noblewomen in small vials disguised as holy water from St. Nicholas's Church in Naples. A few drops in a husband's soup, and the widow could mourn with perfect innocence. Authorities eventually caught its maker, Julia Tofana, but not before hundreds, perhaps thousands, had died. And yet the fascination endured. To poison in the Middle Ages was to manipulate fate itself, to play God with a spoon and a smile. Every banquet was a gamble, every toast a prayer. And as the candles burned low and the goblets clinked, death waited patiently among the silverware. By the late Middle Ages, poison had become so refined that its trade demanded organization. Not every killer used a blade. Some wore robes, counted beads, and pretended to serve God. Hidden beneath monasteries, apothecaries, and even cathedrals, secret networks of poisoners began to emerge, men and women who sold silence in bottles. These were the guilds that no king dared to acknowledge, though many quietly relied on them. The line between saint and sinner blurred within their ranks. Many of these poisoners began as physicians or herbalists, trained in monastic libraries where knowledge of plants was considered divine wisdom. They learned how to heal fevers, soothe wounds, and how to reverse the process entirely. A tincture of monkshood could purify a body. A dose of belladonna could send a soul to judgment. Some took holy vows by day and mixed venoms by night, believing themselves instruments of justice rather than murder. Church authorities knew, they always knew. But as long as the deaths served holy or political purposes, eyes were conveniently closed. The papal courts of Rome, the bishops of France, even the inquisitors themselves sometimes sought these holy apothecaries. A pope could not draw a sword, but he could bless a vial. And when heretics, rivals, or inconvenient nobles fell sick after a papal feast, no one dared to speak. The guilds communicated through coded prayers and symbols. A sprig of wolfsbane carved into wood might mark a safe house. Letters were written in recipes. Add 2 parts of trust, 1 of forgiveness, meant 2 drops at supper, 1 at confession. Even the confessional booth became a place of negotiation, where guilt and payment were both whispered in equal measure. But the church's shadow was not eternal. In time, scandals broke through. Bodies of cardinals and courtiers began piling up faster than grace could explain. Trials were held, but always in secret, always with missing witnesses. Some poisoners vanished into abbeys. Others, like the infamous nun of Hildesheim, were buried alive in cloisters to preserve their silence. Still, the knowledge survived. Because poison, unlike a sword, could not be confiscated. It lived in the mind, carried in prayers, hidden in the rituals of faith. And as the bells tolled over Europe's great cities, those who understood their meaning smiled, knowing death still knelt at the altar. Among the most tragic figures of medieval courts was the food taster, the human shield between monarch and poison. Their duty was simple: to eat, drink, and possibly die so their master might live. They were called gustatores in Latin, though in truth they were closer to sacrificial lambs. Every royal banquet began with their trembling hands. Every toast depended on their heartbeat. Some were slaves, others volunteers rewarded with coin or favour, but all shared the same fate, an existence one bite away from agony. The position demanded more than courage. It required knowledge. A skilled taster learned to detect subtle bitterness or metallic notes, the telltale signs of arsenic or mercury. They observed the colour of wine, the smell of stew, even the way steam rose from a cup. But poisons were evolving faster than their instincts. Some were odourless, others delayed. Many a taster declared a dish safe, only to die hours later alongside their employer. Tasters lived in constant anxiety, their nerves frayed by routine proximity to death. Some resorted to strange rituals, wearing charms of blessed herbs, reciting prayers before each meal, or even cutting themselves slightly before eating, believing the poison would bleed out. A few became half-alchemists, secretly drinking diluted poisons to build resistance, an early form of immunity that sometimes worked, but more often led to slow, painful deterioration. Despite their grim purpose, tasters were often treated as confidants. Kings trusted them more than their own physicians. Queens wept when they died, even if the tears were political. Some monarchs, paranoid beyond reason, employed multiple tasters, each testing the food in succession, their faces watched like omens. If one grimaced or faltered, the meal was thrown away. There are tales of loyalty that bordered on madness. One taster, in the court of Hungary, allegedly leapt forward to drink from a chalice meant for the queen, collapsing moments later with blackened lips. His bravery became legend, his name forgotten. In a world where friendship was illusion and trust was fatal, such men embodied both faith and futility. For every toast raised in golden halls, there was a silent prayer murmured by a trembling servant. Let this taste be clean. Let this breath be mine to keep. In the Middle Ages, politics was not a game of speeches. It was a chessboard soaked in venom. Assassination by blade was crude and messy. Poison, on the other hand, was the weapon of thinkers. It required patience, planning, and the ability to smile at your victim while sealing their fate. Behind every coronation, marriage, and treaty, there was always the possibility that a single sip of wine could rewrite history. Italian city-states like Florence, Milan, and Venice became laboratories of political poisoning. Ambassadors carried antidotes in their belts. Popes dined only with trusted cardinals. Rival families, the Medicis, the Sforzas, the Viscontis, used poison as casually as contracts. A sudden fever was rarely divine. When diplomacy failed, a banquet invitation often followed, and within days the problem was solved. No soldiers needed, no public scandal, just a discreet funeral and a new alliance. France and England were no different. In the 100 Years' War, noblewomen sent poisoned gloves and perfumed handkerchiefs to enemy courtiers. Henry VIII's court whispered endlessly about mysterious deaths. Anne Boleyn's rivals fell ill too often to be coincidence. Even monks serving in royal kitchens were accused of corruption. The kitchens of kings became political minefields, every loaf and bottle a possible instrument of treason. The church tried to condemn poisoners, but secretly benefited from them. Cardinals poisoned other cardinals. Popes blessed the deaths of kings who defied them. God's will, they said. But God's will conveniently aligned with papal politics. Even crusaders carried vials of venom to cripple Saracen leaders, claiming it was holy justice. Some rulers weaponized fear itself. Frederick II of Sicily was rumoured to host banquets where he fed prisoners small doses of toxins, observing their deaths as experiments. His court physicians kept notes like scholars. Such scientific cruelty spread across Europe. Kings wanted to know which poisons killed cleanly, which left the body unmarked, and which could pass as disease. The result was a continent ruled by paranoia. Trust died before most rulers did. Friendship was a liability, and hospitality a potential trap. In the courts of Europe, survival depended not on loyalty, but on observation, on knowing when to refuse a drink, and when to smile while letting someone else sip first. As the medieval world crept toward the dawn of the Renaissance, the poisoner's craft began to merge with something grander: alchemy. What began as a secret art of murder evolved into the scientific pursuit of transformation. Alchemists sought gold, immortality, and divine knowledge, but in their experiments they stumbled upon the most refined poisons known to man. They were not killers by intent, yet death was often their byproduct. Their laboratories were dim sanctuaries of discovery, furnaces burning day and night, crucibles hissing with mercury, arsenic, and antimony. These were the same substances used by assassins, now dressed in the language of philosophy. To the church, it was dangerous curiosity. To kings, it was opportunity. Monarchs began to sponsor alchemists in secret, hoping to turn their knowledge toward both wealth and warfare. A philosopher's stone could grant eternal power, but a poison perfected could destroy a rival in silence. The alchemists' journals read like a blend of scripture and sin. They spoke of aqua fortis, strong water that corroded everything it touched, of mercury, the silver serpent, and of deadly elixirs that promised purification through suffering. Some even argued that poison was not evil, but divine, an agent of natural balance, removing corruption from the world. It was, in their eyes, a form of sacred chemistry. Yet alchemy's obsession with purity blurred moral lines. Experiments on prisoners, beggars, and servants became common, all in the name of discovery. The promise of eternal life demanded a few mortal sacrifices. It was during these centuries that Europe's understanding of toxins reached terrifying precision. Arsenic could now be purified into white powder, indistinguishable from sugar. Lead could be distilled into sweet syrups that killed slowly. Even cosmetics for noblewomen contained lethal doses of mercury and vinegar. Beauty itself became toxic. Ironically, this era of progress created more victims than ever before. The same formulas that laid the foundation for modern chemistry also ensured that death was now portable, odourless, and discreet. By the 15th century, a noble's table was a battlefield of invisible forces: faith, ambition, and science, all colliding in every glass. Alchemy promised enlightenment, but it left a darker inheritance, a Europe that had learned to kill not with swords, but with knowledge. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was exhausted, not from war, but from suspicion. Poison had crept into every corner of life, staining love, politics, and even faith. The glittering courts of kings and queens became dens of quiet fear. Every banquet was a gamble, every friendship a potential death sentence. The old virtues, honour, loyalty, hospitality, had been replaced by caution, antidotes, and the art of pretending. Trust, once the heart of courtly life, was now a luxury few could afford. Noblemen drank only from their own cups, carried personal knives, and travelled with physicians skilled in antidotes. Marriage, once a bond of power, became a contest of endurance. A queen's kiss could be fatal. A husband's toast could be the final betrayal. Lovers met in secret, but always kept their goblets apart. The more glittering the court, the more hollow its laughter became. Rumours thrived where evidence could not. A bishop's sudden illness was whispered to be divine punishment, or perhaps a rival's ambition. A count's pale complexion, a duchess's fainting spell. These became gossip currency, traded between courtiers like poisoned coins. Everyone had a theory, and no one had proof. Poison had achieved what no army ever could: total psychological conquest. Even the apothecaries, those silent masters of the craft, began to vanish. Their art, once a whispered trade, became too dangerous to practice openly. Some fled to distant provinces, taking their knowledge with them. Others were captured and tortured for secrets they refused to give. The Inquisition condemned them as servants of Satan, but secretly used their recipes in interrogation chambers. Death had simply changed uniforms, from royal robe to monk's cowl. And yet, amid the paranoia, there was an odd kind of respect. Poison had become the ultimate symbol of sophistication, intellect, and restraint. It killed with elegance, demanded precision, and punished arrogance. It was not the weapon of the brute, but of the mind. As the Middle Ages faded and the Renaissance dawned, the art of poison did not die. It adapted. New poisons would emerge under new names, dressed in perfume, medicine, and progress. The age of knights had ended, but the age of intrigue had just begun. Because, as every survivor of that era knew too well, power never shouts. It whispers in a cup. They came from the edge of the world, men of ice and iron, born where the sun barely rose in winter. The Vikings had already carved their legend into the coastlines of Britain and Francia, but by the late 10th century, their longships turned eastward, gliding through the black waters of the Baltic and into the great rivers of Rus. What they sought was not new land to settle, but new masters to serve, and new fortunes to claim. These were warriors, shaped by hardship. They had grown up in frozen fjords, trained since childhood to wield axe and shield with effortless brutality. Their world was ruled by honour, blood, and silver. Raiding was survival. Loyalty was a contract paid in gold. So when word spread that far beyond Kiev lay a city of marble and gold, Constantinople, the queen of cities, they listened. It was said the Byzantine emperor himself hired northern mercenaries as his personal guard, men who would answer to no general, no local noble, only to the throne itself. The journey was long and merciless. They followed the great rivers, the Dnieper and the Volga, hauling their ships overland, battling storms, wolves and steppe raiders. Many died before ever glimpsing the Aegean. But those who survived reached a world unlike anything they had ever imagined. Where the north offered ice and pine, Constantinople dazzled with domes of gold, perfumed markets, and cathedrals that touched the clouds. To the Byzantines, these Norsemen were both terrifying and useful. They were giants in furs, speaking a language no Greek could understand, wielding axes that could split armour like butter. Yet beneath the savagery was discipline, the kind forged by endless battle. The emperor recognized something rare in them: loyalty that could not be bought twice. For while Byzantine generals might betray and intrigue, the northerners had one simple rule: serve faithfully and die with honour. Thus, from the ashes of Viking raiding rose something far more enduring: the Varangian Guard. They were not mere mercenaries. They became symbols of fear and devotion, foreign sentinels guarding the heart of an empire. And in the glittering corridors of Constantinople's great palace, their axes gleamed not with blood, but with imperial authority. To reach the heart of Byzantium, the Vikings had to carve a path through an entirely different empire, the land of the Rus. This region, stretching from the forests of Novgorod to the plains of Kiev, was ruled by Norsemen who had settled generations earlier, blending with Slavic tribes and building kingdoms along the rivers. They were kin to the Varangians, descendants of Rurik and Oleg, Vikings turned princes who had traded their sails for crowns. The route they controlled, the famed way from the Varangians to the Greeks, became the lifeline between the cold north and the dazzling south. Through this corridor, longships drifted past misty banks and wooden fortresses. The Dnieper River became both road and trial. Its rapids, called the Dnieper Cataracts, were feared even by seasoned sailors. Warriors had to drag their ships across rocks, while hostile tribes watched from the tree line, waiting to strike. A single ambush could end an expedition before it ever saw profit. But the lure of Byzantine gold outweighed fear, and so, year after year, Norsemen risked the journey. At the heart of this route stood the city of Kiev, ruled by the Grand Prince. It became a trading hub where furs, slaves, honey and amber were exchanged for silks, spices and coins stamped with the emperor's face. Here, Byzantine envoys and Viking chieftains haggled under banners that mingled the cross and the hammer of Thor. Many Varangians swore service in Kiev first, fighting for the Rus' princes before moving south to seek the emperor's favour. By the time they reached Constantinople, they were no longer mere raiders. They were veterans of the river wars, tempered by hardship and united by purpose. The Byzantines called them Varangoi, from Veringjar, meaning oathmen, and their oaths were sacred. Once sworn to the emperor, they were his unto death. Their arrival at the imperial court caused both fascination and unease. These towering foreigners, with braided beards and axes taller than children, stood out amid the polished marble and perfumed courtiers. Yet their reputation preceded them. They had not come to beg or bow. They had come to serve, and in doing so, to carve their saga into the empire's story. The rivers of Russes had carried not just merchants, but destiny. When the first Varangians arrived in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was weary from betrayal. Generals plotted against emperors, palace eunuchs traded secrets like currency, and loyalty was a rarity even among nobles. The imperial throne, gilded and glorious, sat upon a bed of daggers. Emperor Basil II, known to history as the Bulgar Slayer, understood that survival required more than soldiers. It required men who could not be bought. That is why he turned to the north. In the year 988, after the conversion of Prince Vladimir of Kiev to Christianity, Basil struck a deal. Vladimir sent 6,000 of his fiercest warriors to Constantinople in exchange for imperial marriage, ties and gold. These men, battle-hardened and untamed, became the foundation of the Varangian Guard. From that moment, they were bound by oath to the emperor himself, loyal to him alone, even above the empire they served. Their pledge was sacred, sealed not by parchment, but by blood and faith. The Varangians swore to defend the emperor's body and throne with their lives, to stand against all enemies, foreign or domestic. They were exempt from Byzantine politics, their loyalty ensured by distance and culture. They spoke little Greek, cared nothing for the squabbles of court factions, and followed orders with unflinching precision. In battle, their presence was unmistakable. Towering figures in chainmail, wielding massive axes that gleamed like silver, they fought not in tight formations but as living storms, sweeping through enemy ranks with brutal efficiency. To see a Varangian in motion was to witness both chaos and discipline intertwined. Chroniclers describe them as the Emperor's thunder, men who brought silence where rebellion dared to speak. The Byzantines admired and feared them in equal measure. They drank heavily, fought fiercely, and demanded their wages in hard coin, not promises. Yet when the palace gates closed, the emperor could sleep knowing the men outside his door were incorruptible. For centuries, that trust would hold. Thus was born one of the most loyal brotherhoods in medieval history, a foreign army guarding an ancient empire. The Byzantines gave them gold and glory. The Varangians gave them fearlessness, steel, and silence. It was not a mere alliance, it was a covenant of survival. To the Byzantines, the Varangians were both soldiers and symbols, living proof that the emperor's reach extended even into the frozen north. They were called pelakiphoroi, axe-bearers, for their weapon of choice, the great two-handed Dane axe. Forged in the traditions of the Viking North, it was not a tool of finesse but of finality. A single swing could cleave through armour, bone and shield alike. In the marble corridors of the palace, its mere sight was enough to silence conspirators. The Varangians stood apart from every other Byzantine regiment. Their size and ferocity made them a spectacle in an empire of ceremony. Clad in chainmail and fur, with round shields painted in Norse patterns, they towered over the court eunuchs and diplomats who scurried beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia. Foreigners they might have been, but to the emperor they were purity incarnate, unmixed by Byzantine corruption, untempted by gold or flattery. Their loyalty was absolute, but their wrath was legend. In battle, they were the emperor's final word. When rebellion erupted or enemies breached the walls, the Varangians were unleashed like a divine storm. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that their charges fell upon the foe like wolves upon a flock. Even Muslim and Western armies, when facing Byzantium, recorded their terror at the northern giants with axes like moonlight. Training for such men was not gentle. New recruits, often from Scandinavia, Iceland, or later from Anglo-Saxon England after the Norman conquest, had to prove themselves through endurance. They drilled endlessly under the burning Anatolian sun, learning Byzantine formations, shield techniques, and palace protocol. Yet they never lost their northern edge, the brutal efficiency of warriors raised on sagas and storms. When they guarded the emperor in procession, their axes glinted in the sun, a reminder to all that divine authority had muscle behind it. And when they fought in distant campaigns, in Syria, Sicily, or the Balkans, they carried the empire's banner with the same devotion they had once shown to Odin. In their hands, the Viking spirit found a new home, not in raiding or conquest, but in service to the world's richest throne. The axe of the north had become the shield of the east. The Varangians were not palace ornaments. They were warriors first, bodyguards second. When the empire went to war, the emperor brought his northern guard to the front lines. They were his assurance that no matter what happened, his command would stand. The chronicles of the 10th and 11th centuries are scattered with their deeds, where their axes bit deep into both Christian and Muslim foes. Their baptism of fire came during the campaigns of Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer. Against the Bulgarians, the Varangians became instruments of relentless vengeance. They fought through the rugged mountains of the Balkans, hacking through ambushes and fortresses alike. The Bulgarians called them blue-eyed demons, tireless, merciless, unstoppable. When Basil finally defeated the Bulgarians and blinded thousands of prisoners, the Varangians formed a wall around him, their faces as cold as their homeland. They did not question his cruelty. They enforced it. Over the following decades, they marched with Byzantine armies into Asia Minor, Sicily, and southern Italy. Wherever the emperor's banner appeared, the Varangians followed, their long axes flashing amid Greek lances and Armenian archers. At the Battle of Cannae in 1018, not to be confused with Hannibal's ancient slaughter, they helped crush the Lombards and Normans, proving that the warriors of the north could adapt to the cunning warfare of the Mediterranean. Their courage was matched only by their appetite for treasure. Byzantium paid them well: gold coins, silk, and spoils of war. Their share of loot was legendary, and their right to claim it was sacred. When they entered a captured city, they took their pay by force, plundering with the emperor's permission. Their devotion was fierce, but it was not selfless. To a Varangian, loyalty and reward were two sides of the same coin, but their most dangerous battles were not always fought on open fields. At times they had to defend the emperor from his own people, rebellious generals, treacherous nobles, and mobs of Constantinople itself. When the capital erupted in riots, it was the Varangians who stormed the streets, axes dripping with both foreign and Greek blood. In war and peace alike, they became Byzantium's iron heartbeat, and with every campaign their legend spread, from the icy fjords of Norway to the sunlit domes of Constantinople. By the mid-11th century, a new breed of warrior arrived to swell the Varangian ranks. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, thousands of Anglo-Saxon warriors, dispossessed, bitter, and battle-hardened, fled across Europe in search of a new master. They had lost their homes, their kings, and their pride at Hastings. But in the east, they found redemption. The Byzantines called them Englinovarangoi, the English Varangians, and soon they outnumbered the Norse themselves. Their journey was desperate and long. Bands of exiles made their way across the continent, fighting as mercenaries in foreign wars until they reached the glittering gates of Constantinople. There, the emperor welcomed them eagerly. To him, they were ideal recruits, disciplined, devout Christians who shared the Varangian reputation for loyalty and courage. The English swore the same ancient oath, to serve the emperor unto death, and were absorbed into the guard as if born to it. They brought with them their own traditions, the long, broad-bladed axes of England, battle songs from Wessex and Mercia, and a deep hatred for the Normans who had taken their homeland. Many saw the Byzantine emperor as a kind of lost Arthur, a sovereign worthy of their blades. Chroniclers described them as lions of the north, fierce and mournful men who fought as if each battle might cleanse their defeat at Hastings. In time, the Varangian Guard became a tapestry of northern blood, Scandinavians, Englishmen, Danes, and Icelanders serving shoulder to shoulder beneath the double-headed eagle. They still drank hard, swore loud, and fought with terrifying precision, but they had also become something new, a brotherhood without homeland. Byzantine poets wrote that their voices echoed like thunder in the corridors of the great palace, and that their laughter shook the marble columns. They guarded emperors, crushed rebellions, and even served as ambassadors abroad. Yet among themselves, they remained fiercely independent, keeping their sagas and runes alive in secret halls within the city. The Anglo-Saxon Varangians gave the guard new energy, new numbers, and new grief. They were men who had lost everything except their code. In Constantinople, that code found purpose once again: iron loyalty, honest service, and vengeance cloaked in discipline. For an exiled warrior, no reward was greater than honour restored in a foreign empire. To the outside world, the Varangian Guard seemed like a band of mercenaries. But within the marble walls of Constantinople, they were far more, a symbol of divine protection. They guarded not just an emperor, but the idea of the emperor. To stand among them was to stand between chaos and civilization itself. Every Byzantine ruler knew that his throne might one day crumble beneath intrigue or invasion. Yet as long as the Varangians stood by the palace gates, no dagger could strike him unawares. Their duties went far beyond the battlefield. They stood watch at every imperial ceremony, coronations, triumphs, processions through Hagia Sophia. Draped in armour of gold and blue, their axes resting upon their shoulders, they looked less like men than statues come to life. Foreign envoys who entered the palace often wrote home about them, towering northerners with blonde beards and eyes like frozen rivers, whose silence was more terrifying than any threat. When they struck their axes upon the marble floors in salute, the sound echoed through the entire palace like a thunderclap of loyalty. Inside those same halls, they guarded the emperor's private chambers, his treasury, and the sacred relics of the empire. The keys to those doors were not trusted to eunuchs or nobles, but to the Varangians. They slept near the emperor's quarters, ready to die before allowing harm to reach him. When an emperor died, it was the Varangians who sealed the gates, ensuring a peaceful succession, or at times, enforcing a violent one. Their loyalty was to the throne, not the man who occupied it. Yet their discipline was not purely obedience, it was pride. To serve in the guard was the greatest honour a northern warrior could achieve. Many spent their wages on gifts for their families back home, sending Byzantine gold across the seas. Others retired to estates in Greece or Anatolia, blending into local life. But most never left the palace's shadow. For nearly 2 centuries they stood as Constantinople's unbreakable wall. When enemies stormed the capital, they were the last to yield. When emperors were crowned, they were the first to kneel. The Varangian Guard was not merely the emperor's shield, it was his soul in steel. Loyalty in Byzantium was a fragile thing, but the Varangians gave it weight in steel. When others betrayed, they avenged. When generals rebelled, they executed. Their reputation as incorruptible guardians made them both revered and feared, because when an emperor fell, it was often the Varangians who delivered the final blow. The empire's throne changed hands countless times between the 10th and 12th centuries, often soaked in blood and ambition, and every coup had one question at its heart: whose side are the Varangians on? Their oath bound them to the emperor, but not necessarily to the man wearing the crown. If the ruler was overthrown through legitimate proclamation, the guard adapted with chilling efficiency. But if betrayal reeked of treason, their axes spoke for justice. One of their most infamous interventions came in 1078, when Emperor Nikephoros III was deposed by Alexios Komnenos. The palace descended into chaos as conspirators swarmed through the corridors. But the Varangians held the gates, forming a human fortress around the aging emperor. Chroniclers say they guarded him to the end, escorting him unharmed into monastic exile. They could have turned and killed him for profit, but they did not. They obeyed the law of loyalty, not politics. Yet there were darker moments. When Emperor Andronikos Komnenos seized power in 1183, he unleashed the Varangians against his enemies in the palace itself. Witnesses described the corridors running red as the guard carried out executions with mechanical precision. Men were dragged from the banquet halls and beheaded before the marble icons of Christ. To the Varangians, it was not cruelty. It was duty. Their very presence became a form of psychological warfare. The emperor's enemies did not fear exile or prison. They feared hearing the echo of Varangian boots outside their chamber at night. To face the imperial guard was to face death, and worse, dishonour. Still, they remained strangely untainted by the corruption surrounding them. The guard did not plot or scheme. They did not rule. They enforced. In a world where treachery was as common as prayer, they were constant, brutal, disciplined, and incorruptible. The Byzantines called them axe-bearers of divine wrath. And for centuries, that title was not a metaphor. It was prophecy. By the 12th century, the world that had made the Varangian Guard indispensable was fading. The Byzantines were no longer the unstoppable empire of Basil II's age. Enemies surrounded them. Normans from the west, Turks from the east, and crusaders marching under banners that claimed to serve Christ but served greed instead. The Varangians, once the empire's hammer, were now its shield against a crumbling world. Their ranks had changed too. The fierce Norse and Anglo-Saxon bloodlines that once defined the Guard were slowly diluted by recruits from the empire's own provinces, Balkans, Rus, and even mercenaries from the steppe. The proud northern tongue still echoed in their barracks, but less and less each year. Still, the spirit of the old oath endured, loyalty to the emperor until death. In 1204, that oath was tested one final time. When the Fourth Crusade turned its swords against Constantinople, the Varangians stood their ground while most of the Byzantine army fled or surrendered. The Crusaders breached the walls, looting the city with fire and steel. Amid the chaos, the last true Varangians fought to the end, barricading the gates of the great palace, their axes cleaving through knights in shining mail. Chroniclers wrote that the northern men fought like lions, buying time for what remained of the imperial family to escape. When the smoke cleared, the palace was a ruin, and the Varangian guard was gone. Some were slain in the streets, others fled east to serve the Empire of Nicaea, or vanished into legend. A few may have sailed home, carrying Byzantine gold and sorrow in equal measure. The brotherhood that had once guarded emperors, conquered rebels, and shaped the fate of nations had finally met an enemy even they could not defeat: time. Yet their legacy endured. For centuries afterward, travellers told tales of axe-bearing giants who once stood watch beside golden thrones. In the sagas of Iceland, they became heroes who found glory far from home. In Byzantine memory, they remained the ideal of loyalty, foreigners who understood the empire better than many born within it. The Varangian Guard was more than an army. It was an oath made flesh, and though their axes rusted and their halls fell silent, the echo of their loyalty still rang through history, unyielding, unbroken, eternal. When the first Crusader knights rode east, they swore vows that made them sound like saints in armour. They promised to live chastely, to renounce greed, and to fight only for the glory of God. The Church blessed them as holy warriors, defenders of Christ's tomb, soldiers of heaven's army. But once the helmets came off and the banners were furled, a different truth emerged. Beneath the white cloaks and red crosses were not angels, but men, burning with the same desires they were sworn to destroy. The journey to the Holy Land was long and punishing. Many knights left behind families, debts, and fading reputations. To them, the crusade was not just faith, it was escape. The Church promised salvation, forgiveness of sins, even eternal paradise. But for most, it also promised land, plunder, and glory. And as they marched through strange lands, starving, sweating, and killing in the name of God, the line between devotion and indulgence began to blur. They prayed in the morning, then slaughtered villages by noon. They kissed the cross, then looted churches before dusk. Even the chroniclers of the age, writing under royal and papal favour, could not hide it entirely. The same men who took vows of purity were seen in the taverns of Antioch, drunk on sweet wine and boasting of their miracles with local women. One bishop complained that the Knights of Christ have turned into wolves of greed. And yet, to the outside world, their sanctity remained untouched. Pilgrims who saw them ride into Jerusalem wept at the sight, steel glinting in the sun, banners of the cross fluttering above blood-stained streets. To the common man, these warriors were the arm of God. To those who lived among them, they were the embodiment of contradiction, confessing at dawn, committing sin by nightfall. Behind the sermons and songs of holy victory, there existed a quieter, darker rhythm, the rhythm of indulgence. The Church might call it weakness, but for many knights, it was survival. They had faced horror beyond imagination. Pleasure became the only remedy. And so, the Holy Mask remained intact, a shining facade of purity covering the rot beneath. They fought for God, yes, but they lived, and often died, for themselves. Jerusalem, the city of God, was supposed to be the heart of holiness. Yet under Crusader rule, it often resembled a marketplace of temptation. By day, pilgrims from every corner of Christendom filled its streets with prayers and processions. By night, the same alleys pulsed with laughter, wine, and flesh. Where relics were sold by priests, pleasure was sold by women. The Holy Land had become profitable, and sin had become its most reliable currency. Brothels stood only a few streets away from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Knights who had sworn chastity marched into them beneath the cover of darkness, their crosses hidden beneath cloaks. Chroniclers in the East spoke of women of all nations and tongues gathering near the Crusader camps, Greek courtesans, Syrian dancers, even widows of fallen soldiers. They served not only as comfort, but as business. Some brothels paid taxes directly to the Crusader lords who frequented them. Chastity, like everything else in the Holy Land, had a price. Wine flowed just as freely. Imported from Cyprus and the ports of Italy, it filled the taverns that lined the markets of Acre and Tyre. Soldiers drowned their guilt in it, boasting of victories and sins alike. Gambling tables stood beside shrines. Dice rolled while monks chanted in nearby chapels. Even relic sellers, those who claimed to trade in the bones of saints, were often little more than swindlers, peddling sheep bones dipped in incense. For the common pilgrim, it was dizzying. Here stood the tomb of Christ, surrounded by whores, merchants, and drunken knights. Preachers tried to warn the faithful, calling the Crusader states Sodom reborn. But few listened. Too much gold flowed through those streets, and too many soldiers preferred indulgence to repentance. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same men who had crossed continents to cleanse Jerusalem of sin were now the ones keeping it alive. The city that was meant to redeem them became their undoing. And yet, amid all this corruption, they still prayed. They confessed, kissed their crucifixes, and rode into battle believing God still favoured them. Perhaps he did, or perhaps he merely watched, silent, as his warriors bought salvation by day and pleasure by night. For all their vows of poverty, many Crusader knights became merchants of sin in armour. War had opened trade routes across the Mediterranean, and with them came temptation. Gold, spices, relics, and lies. The Holy Land was supposed to be the meeting point of heaven and earth. Instead, it became the world's most lucrative black market. Knights who once swore to die for God now smuggled his relics for profit. Crusader ports like Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre thrived on corruption. Ships flying the cross unloaded not pilgrims and supplies, but barrels of stolen wine, silks looted from Byzantine churches, and perfumes from Muslim caravans. Some knights sold sacred icons to Venetian merchants who resold them to churches in Europe as genuine relics of the saints. Others carried fake holy artifacts, splinters of the true cross, vials of Christ's blood, or bones of St. Peter, and made fortunes deceiving pious buyers. The irony was divine. The men who claimed to defend the sacred were now its most profitable thieves. Bribery was everywhere. Captains paid Crusader officials to overlook the sale of Muslim slaves, or to grant trading privileges forbidden by papal law. Even bishops joined the racket, blessing ships that smuggled goods straight from Muslim ports. The church thundered against greed from afar, but its local representatives often took their cut in gold. A few crusading orders, like the Templars and Hospitallers, tried to maintain discipline, but many of their rank-and-file brothers found ways to enrich themselves while preaching poverty. At night, the harbours of Acre shimmered with torchlight as cargo was unloaded in silence. Knights disguised as dockhands supervised shipments of spices and silver. By dawn, they knelt at Mass, crossing themselves as if no sin had passed their lips. Pilgrims, dazzled by the splendour of the holy city, never suspected that the same men guiding them to the holy shrines had been fencing stolen relics hours before. The crusade had begun as a spiritual war, but for too many, it became a business venture wrapped in scripture. Christ's soldiers, one chronicler wrote bitterly, sell his cross to pay for their whore. The greatest treasure of the Holy Land was no longer faith, it was profit. For all their prayers and pilgrimages, the Crusader knights were men of flesh before they were men of faith. Celibacy was the rule, but it was rarely the reality. Surrounded by temptation in foreign lands, the holy warriors who had sworn to resist lust often surrendered to it willingly. In the camps outside Jerusalem and Antioch, pleasure was as common as prayer, and far more reliable. Women followed the armies wherever they went. Some were local prostitutes seeking safety among the knights. Others were camp followers from Europe, wives, widows, or women who disguised themselves as servants to survive. Chroniclers complained that the Crusader camps reeked of sin, filled with tents where warriors confessed their lust one night and repeated it the next. Even priests, sent to guide them spiritually, found themselves corrupted by proximity. One chronicler accused entire garrisons of turning Jerusalem into a brothel of Christ. The church tried to fight back with rules. Edicts forbade knights from bringing women into their camps. Soldiers caught in adultery were threatened with excommunication, but in practice, no one enforced it. Commanders needed their men calm and loyal, and nothing soothed a restless army like the promise of a woman and a cup of wine after battle. Not all the knights sought mere pleasure. Some built entire secret households in the east. They took Syrian or Armenian mistresses, fathered children, and lived like lords of a new world. In the Crusader states, where law bent to power, the church turned a blind eye as long as the tithe was paid. These unions blurred boundaries, creating generations of half-European children who carried both the sword and the scent of incense. Meanwhile, brothels flourished under military protection. A portion of their earnings even went to support garrisons, turning lust into an unofficial form of taxation. To the cynical, it was simply another way to fund the war. To the knights, it was survival in a land where death could arrive any dawn. Their banners bore crosses, their oaths swore purity, but their knights told another story. In the Holy Land, faith was armour for the soul, but the body always found a way to win. If the Crusades began in piety, they were sustained by profit. Every holy banner concealed a purse, and every oath of service hid a transaction. A knight might ride for the glory of God, but he expected payment in gold, land, or power. The Pope promised heaven, but the lords of Jerusalem promised estates, and that, for many, was the true gospel. Corruption ran like blood through the veins of the Crusader states. Bribes decided everything: appointments, supplies, even absolution. Commanders paid for papal forgiveness in advance, a convenient arrangement known as sin credit. Soldiers extorted money from pilgrims under the guise of protection fees. Bishops who preached against greed during Mass spent their afternoons counting their cut of the spoils. In the name of purity, the holy warriors bled the Holy Land dry. Crusader castles became banks before Europe had banks. Gold seized from conquered cities, Muslim, Jewish, or even Christian, was melted and stored under chapels. One Templar commander wrote in secret that the coffers of God are heavy with blood, yet the same wealth bought influence. Gifts to the church ensured forgiveness, and indulgences transformed robbery into righteousness. For the right price, even the dirtiest knight could polish his soul to a divine shine. Trade became another weapon of hypocrisy. Venetian and Genoese merchants, supposedly serving the crusading cause, sold weapons and grain to both sides, Crusaders and Muslims alike. The knights pretended outrage, then quietly joined in. Smuggling was not sin if it paid for armour or horses. Many Crusaders returned to Europe richer than princes, boasting of the grace of God, though it was grace minted in the form of Byzantine coins and Syrian spices. Even relics became currency. The arm of St. George, the veil of the Virgin, and other sacred objects changed hands in shadowy deals across the Mediterranean. Few questioned their authenticity. Fewer cared. What mattered was the price. The crusade had turned holiness itself into a marketplace. And through it all, they still prayed. They confessed, took communion, and called themselves soldiers of Christ. But when their prayers ended, they counted their earnings. For in the Crusaders' creed, salvation might be won in heaven, but profit was claimed on earth. If faith was the soul of the Crusades, wine was its bloodstream. It flowed in rivers through camps, cities, and castles, turning holy zeal into drunken bravado. Knights who were supposed to live in purity and prayer often spent their evenings soaked in drink, arguing theology between hiccups. Pilgrims described taverns overflowing with armoured men singing hymns one moment and brawling the next. In the Holy Land, wine was cheaper than water and more reliable than confession. The Church condemned drunkenness as a sin, yet priests themselves were often guilty. Monks brewed ale in monasteries. Bishops imported barrels of Cypriot and Italian wine to celebrate Mass. But the line between sacred use and indulgence quickly blurred. Chronicles from the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem mention feasts lasting days, where knights gorged themselves on roasted lamb and strong wine while the poor begged outside the gates. At such banquets, sermons dissolved into laughter, and holy relics became table decorations. Alcohol dulled fear and guilt alike. Crusaders who had seen horrors, massacres, starvation, betrayal, found solace in the oblivion of drink. Some claimed wine was their only comfort in a cursed land. Others used it to justify sin. "We fight for Christ," one knight reportedly declared, "and so we may drink for him also." That logic, though absurd, became their armour against shame. The effects were predictable. Drunken brawls in the streets of Acre were common, sometimes ending in murder. Soldiers killed each other over spilled wine or stolen coins. Commanders imposed curfews, but no law could stop thirst. Even after defeats, when discipline should have mattered most, casks were opened to drown despair. Priests blessed the dead, while survivors stumbled through the ruins with goblets in hand. Ironically, the same wine that fueled their vice also symbolized their faith. Every Mass reminded them that Christ's blood had been turned into wine. Perhaps that gave them permission to drink deeply, to forget, to survive. The Crusades were soaked in it, victories celebrated, sins forgotten, vows ignored. The cross might have been their banner, but the bottle was their comfort, and as the centuries passed, the line between communion and corruption faded completely. They came to shed blood for Christ. But most nights, they only spilled wine. If sin was their habit, then piety was their disguise. The Crusader knights became masters of appearances, publicly humble, privately indulgent. Every act of vice was followed by a gesture of faith, a confession, a donation, a pilgrimage within the pilgrimage. They knew the art of cleansing their image better than their souls. And in a world where holiness could be bought, forgiveness was just another transaction. When word spread of brothels, smuggling, and corruption in the Holy Land, the knights responded not with repentance, but with ceremony. They built chapels inside their castles, sponsored processions, and paraded relics before the people. Some even paid priests to publicly bless them before entering the very same taverns they were condemned for visiting. Hypocrisy became a sacrament. They sinned in secret and prayed in public, ensuring that their reputations remained as polished as their swords. The Church, far from blind, often played along. The crusading orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights projected an image of saintly discipline, but behind monastery walls, politics, rivalry, and greed flourished. Knights donated fortunes to monasteries not out of devotion, but to erase their sins from record. A massacre could be forgiven with enough silver. Adultery could vanish behind a donation for a new altar. Faith had become an accounting system. Sin in one column, indulgence in the other. Crusader chroniclers, eager to preserve the illusion of sanctity, rarely wrote of this duality. They praised valour and downplayed vice. Yet occasional fragments of truth slipped through. Letters from bishops lamenting that the soldiers of Christ have learned all sins save honesty. To ordinary pilgrims, these knights were living contradictions, confessing at dawn, extorting by noon, and kneeling in candlelight by nightfall. Still, their image endured. Artists in Europe painted them as glowing heroes, their eyes fixed on heaven, their swords shining with divine justice. No one wanted to hear about the hangovers, the bribes, or the blood-stained coins in their purses. The myth was cleaner than the man. And so, under the cloak of piety, the Crusader knight marched on, holy in song, corrupt in truth. He carried a cross on his chest, but the weight he bore was not salvation. It was guilt, hidden beneath polished armour, and the endless illusion of righteousness. By the late 12th century, the crusading dream had begun to rot from within. The knights who once vowed to reclaim the Holy Land now turned their blades on fellow Christians, their greed eclipsing their faith. The Crusades had started as a march toward Jerusalem. They ended as a competition for gold, power, and vengeance. And the world was watching as the soldiers of Christ forgot why they had ever taken the cross. The decline began quietly. The knights grew wealthy from taxes, trade and bribes. Their castles stood as fortresses of both defence and indulgence, wine cellars beneath chapels, courtesans living in towers once meant for prayer. Piety became pageantry. In public, they paraded relics through the streets. In private, they gambled away tithes meant for the poor. Even crusader kings, men like Guy of Lusignan and Amalric, treated Jerusalem less as a holy duty and more as a prize to fund their dynasties. When the Muslims, led by Salah ad-Din, began to strike back, many knights were too divided or distracted to respond. Factions feuded, commanders betrayed one another, and rumours of sorcery and heresy spread like wildfire. Some sold fortresses for gold, others defected outright. The once mighty army of the cross collapsed under its own corruption. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual humiliation. Chroniclers described knights weeping at the empty tomb, but others saw opportunity even in ruin. Relics were stolen and sold to Europe. Churches were looted under the excuse of relocation. When the news reached Rome, the Pope thundered with rage, but even he knew the truth. The Crusades had lost their soul long before they lost the city. And yet, Europe still adored them. Songs of holy valour echoed in cathedrals while, in reality, the Crusader states decayed into chaos. Few wanted to see that the warriors of God had become mercenaries of their own faith. The fall of the Crusader knight was not caused by defeat in battle, but by decay of spirit. They had conquered cities, but lost themselves. Their swords once pointed toward heaven. Now they merely pointed at whatever paid the most. When the last Crusader strongholds fell in the 13th century, the age of holy war should have ended. But what it left behind was far more enduring than any victory, a legend polished clean of its filth. In Europe, bards sang of chivalry, of noble knights defending the cross against the infidel. The truth, the drunkenness, the brothels, the bribes, the hypocrisy, was quietly buried beneath hymns and stone monuments. The Crusader knight became a myth, not a man. Those who returned from the East carried their sins home in silence. Some joined monasteries, desperate for redemption. Others flaunted their wealth, building churches as monuments to both faith and guilt. Relics, stolen from Jerusalem, filled European cathedrals, bones of saints, chalices of gold, even splinters of the true cross, some real, most forged. The people believed, and belief was all that mattered. The Church, eager to preserve its legacy, turned the Crusades into morality plays. The knights' vices were rewritten as temptations overcome, their crimes as tests of faith. The same men who had murdered and stolen in the name of God were now depicted in stained glass as paragons of virtue. It was a triumph of illusion, the transformation of blood and lust into legend. Yet in the shadows of history, a different legacy endured. The Crusaders had spread not holiness, but habits, greed sanctified by religion, violence excused by righteousness. They had shown Europe that sin could march under the banner of the cross and still call itself holy. That lesson would echo for centuries, shaping wars, politics, and conquest far beyond the Holy Land. And still, the image of the Crusader persisted, a shining knight with a red cross, sword raised toward heaven. It was comforting, easier to love than the truth. But behind that image were men who bartered relics, bedded strangers, and bled the world dry in the name of salvation. Their story is not one of faith triumphant. It is one of faith corrupted. They built churches on stolen gold and prayed with bloody hands. Yet perhaps that is what makes their legacy human. The Crusader knights sought heaven but found only themselves, flawed, proud, and forever haunted by the sins they sanctified.